The air in the holding room was stale, heavy with the scent of industrial cleaner and the faint tang of desperation. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a cold, unforgiving light on the chipped linoleum floor. Ernesto Ernie Morales sat on a metal bench, his hands folded neatly in his lap, though his fingers twitched slightly, betraying the weight of the moment. His faded green jacket, patched at the elbows, hung loosely on his wiry frame. A small duffel bag rested at his feet, containing everything he owned: a few shirts, a pair of worn boots, and a leather-bound journal with pages yellowed by time. Tucked inside the journal was a photograph, creased and dog-eared, of a younger Ernie in desert camouflage, standing shoulder to shoulder with his squad under a blazing Iraqi sun. That was 1991, a lifetime ago. The immigration officer, a young man with a clipboard and a face too smooth for the job, stood by the door. 10 minutes, Mr. Morales, he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. Then we board the bus. Ernie nodded, his eyes fixed on a crack in the floor. 10 minutes to say goodbye to the country he'd called home for 40 years. 10 minutes to pack up a life that had included 15 years in the U.S. Army, 2 tours in the Gulf War, and a Purple Heart he'd never shown anyone. 10 minutes to reconcile the fact that, despite all that, he was now just a name on a deportation order, a man without papers, without a claim to the land he'd bled for. The holding room was in a small processing center just outside Tucson, Arizona, a low-slung building surrounded by chain-link fences and desert scrub. Outside, the late afternoon sun baked the asphalt, and the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 10 carried on the dry wind. Ernie could hear the faint snap of a flagpole in the courtyard, the stars and stripes flapping in the breeze. He'd saluted that flag thousands of times. On bases in Fort Bragg, in the sands of Kuwait, at ceremonies where men in crisp uniforms pinned medals on his chest. Now, it felt like the flag had turned its back on him. He wasn't angry. That was the thing about Ernie. He didn't do anger. Not when he'd enlisted at 18, a skinny kid from a Mexican border town who'd crossed into the U.S. with nothing but a dream of a better life. Not when he'd taken shrapnel in his leg during a firefight in Basra, limping through the pain to drag a wounded buddy to safety. Not even now when the country he'd served was sending him back to a place he barely remembered. Instead, he carried a quiet resignation, a stoicism carved into him by years of duty and loss. His dark eyes, framed by deep lines, held stories he rarely told. His hands, calloused and scarred, bore the weight of a life spent serving others. The door creaked open, and a woman entered, a caseworker named Maria, who'd been assigned to him a week ago when the deportation notice arrived. She was in her 30s, with tired eyes and a clipboard of her own. She'd been kind to Ernie, though he could tell she was overwhelmed, juggling dozens of cases like his. She sat across from him, her chair scraping against the floor. "Ernie," she said softly, "I'm so sorry it's come to this. I tried to get an appeal, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "The law's clear. No exceptions, not even for veterans." Ernie offered a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's okay, Maria. You did what you could." She frowned, flipping through her papers as if hoping to find some overlooked loophole. "It's not okay. You serve this country. You've got a Purple Heart, for God's sake. This shouldn't be happening." Ernie shrugged, his shoulders barely moving. "Rules are rules. I knew the risks when I enlisted." He didn't mention the recruiter who'd promised him citizenship, the one who'd said, "Serve honorably, and we'll take care of you." He didn't mention the years of paperwork, the endless forms, the bureaucratic maze that had swallowed his application and spit out rejection after rejection. He'd been young, naive, believing that loyalty and sacrifice would be enough. Now, at 68, he knew better. Maria leaned forward, her voice low. "There's a group outside. Veterans advocates, some local reporters. They want to talk to you, maybe make a scene. It could buy you some time." Ernie shook his head. "No scenes. I don't want to fuss. Just let it be." Maria sighed, her frustration palpable. She'd seen too many cases like this. Veterans who'd served under the assumption that their service would protect them, only to find themselves discarded when the system caught up. Ernie was different, though. Most of her clients were angry, scared, or defiant. Ernie was calm, like he'd already accepted the weight of the world and decided to carry it without complaint. The officer glanced at his watch. 8 minutes. Ernie's gaze drifted to the window where a sliver of the desert sky was visible through the bars. He thought of the last time he'd felt truly at home. A 4th of July barbecue in 2005 at a VFW hall in Tucson. He'd been out of the Army for a decade by then, working odd jobs, construction, landscaping, anything to keep the lights on. The hall had been packed with veterans, their families, and kids running around with sparklers. Someone had handed him a beer, clapped him on the back, and said, "You're one of us, Ernie." He'd felt it then, the sense of belonging, the pride of being part of something bigger. He hadn't felt it since. The door opened again, this time admitting a young man in a crisp Air Force uniform. He was maybe 25, with a buzz cut and a nervous energy that made him seem out of place in the sterile room. His name tag read, Lieutenant Carter. He carried a small box under one arm, and his eyes scanned the room before landing on Ernie. "Mr. Morales?" he asked, his voice hesitant but respectful. Ernie looked up, surprised. "That's me." The lieutenant crossed the room in a few strides, his boots clicking against the linoleum. He stopped in front of Ernie, standing at attention. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Daniel Carter, with the 355th Wing at Davis-Monthan. I heard about your case." Ernie's brow furrowed. "Heard from who?" "Word got around the base," Carter said. "Some of the older guys at the VFW, they remembered you. Said you were a hell of a soldier. I looked up your record. First Gulf War, 101st Airborne, Purple Heart. You were at Kofji, right?" Ernie nodded slowly, his mind flashing back to the chaos of that night in 1991. The roar of artillery, the choking smoke, the screams of men caught in the crossfire. He'd been 24, scared out of his mind, but he'd kept moving, kept fighting. He didn't like to talk about it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I was there." Carter's jaw tightened, and he glanced at the immigration officer, who was watching with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Sir, I don't have much time, but I needed to see you before—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the word deportation. Instead, he held out the box. "This is for you." Ernie took it, his hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. The box was small, made of polished wood, with a brass clasp. He opened it to find a folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals or retirements. Beneath it was a certificate, embossed with the seal of the 101st Airborne, acknowledging his service. And at the bottom, a single dog tag, etched with his name and service number. "We found it in storage at the base," Carter explained. "It was supposed to be given to you years ago, but things got lost in the shuffle. I thought you should have it." Ernie stared at the dog tag, his thumb brushing over the worn metal. He remembered the weight of it around his neck, the way it had felt like a promise, of duty, of brotherhood, of a future. He hadn't seen it since he'd left the Army in 1995, when he'd turned it in along with his dreams of citizenship. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter shook his head. "No, sir, thank you." He hesitated, then snapped to attention and saluted, his hand crisp against his brow. "It's an honor to meet you." The immigration officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his watch again. 5 minutes. Maria's eyes were wet, but she didn't speak. Ernie closed the box, clutching it to his chest. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he'd thought was gone. Pride, not the loud, chest-thumping kind, but the quiet certainty that he'd done something worthwhile, even if the world had forgotten. Outside, the sound of voices grew louder. Ernie caught snippets through the window. Protesters, maybe, or the reporters Maria had mentioned. He didn't want their pity or their cameras. He just wanted to leave with dignity, to carry his memories across the border and start over again. But Carter wasn't done. "Sir, there's something else," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I don't know if this will change anything, but I wrote to my CO, and he wrote to his. We're trying to get your case reopened. The governor's office is looking into it. It's not much, but it's a start. Ernie blinked, caught off guard. Why would you do that? Carter's face softened, and for a moment, he looked less like an officer and more like a kid who just learned what it meant to be a man. Because you're one of us, he said simply, and we don't leave our own behind. The words hit Ernie like a punch, stirring memories of dusty barracks, of soldiers sharing cigarettes under starlit skies, of promises made and kept. He'd spent years believing he'd been forgotten, that his service had been erased by a system that saw him as a number, not a name. But here was this young lieutenant, barely older than Ernie had been when he'd enlisted, standing up for him in a way no one else had. The officer cleared his throat. Time's up, Mr. Morales. We need to move. Ernie stood, his knees creaking but his back straight. He tucked the wooden box under his arm and picked up his duffel bag. Maria rose too, wiping her eyes. I'll keep fighting for you, Ernie, she said. This isn't over. He nodded, grateful but unsure if he believed her. The system was bigger than any one person, bigger than good intentions or last-minute salutes. But as he followed the officer toward the door, Lieutenant Carter fell into step beside him. I'm walking you out, Carter said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They stepped into the courtyard, where the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The flagpole stood tall, the American flag snapping in the evening breeze. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 20 people, a mix of veterans in old caps and jackets, a few reporters with notepads, and a handful of locals holding signs that read, Honor our veterans and Justice for Ernie. They fell silent as Ernie emerged, their eyes following him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but Carter's presence steadied him. The lieutenant stopped at the edge of the courtyard, facing the crowd. This is Ernesto Morales, he said, his voice carrying over the murmur of the wind. He served this country with honor. He fought for us, bled for us. And today, we're failing him. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Ernie wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the desert, but Carter's hand on his shoulder kept him rooted. I'm just one guy, Carter continued, but I'm asking all of you, don't let this be the end of his story. He deserves better. A veteran in the crowd, an older man with a Vietnam patch on his jacket, stepped forward. He saluted Ernie, his hand trembling but steady in its purpose. One by one, others followed. Veterans, civilians, even a kid holding a sign. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras clicking. Ernie's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he returned the salutes, his hand moving automatically, muscle memory from a lifetime ago. The officer beside him shifted, clearly unsure how to handle the scene. We need to go, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria stepped forward, holding up her phone. Ernie, the governor's office just called. They're granting a temporary stay. You're not getting on that bus today. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Ernie stood still, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. A stay wasn't a victory, not yet. It was a delay, a chance to keep fighting. But as he looked at the faces around him, Carter, Maria, the veterans, the strangers who'd shown up for a man they didn't know, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He clutched the wooden box tighter, the dog tag inside a reminder of who he'd been, who he still was. The desert wind carried the sound of the flag, and for a moment, Ernie allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could still belong. This is the first part of Ernesto Morales' story, a tale of quiet sacrifice and unexpected redemption. At Hoffman's Stories, we believe in honoring the unseen heroes among us, those whose courage and service shape our communities, even when the world looks away. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to read the conclusion of Ernie's journey and discover more stories that remind us to see, to honor, and to act with compassion. Who's the unnoticed hero in your life? Take a moment today to acknowledge them. It might just change their world. The Tucson sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the courtyard of the Immigration Processing Center bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of creosote and dust, and the American flag on its pole fluttered gently, its colors muted in the fading light. Ernesto Ernie Morales stood at the center of a small crowd, still clutching the wooden box Lieutenant Daniel Carter had given him. its weight both grounding and surreal. The cheers from moments ago, when Maria announced the governor's temporary stay of his deportation, had quieted, replaced by a hum of murmured conversations and the occasional click of a reporter's camera. Ernie felt the eyes on him, not with judgment, but with something he hadn't felt in years: respect. Yet beneath it, a familiar unease stirred. This wasn't over. A stay was just a pause, not a promise. Lieutenant Carter stood beside him, his Air Force uniform crisp despite the desert heat. The young officer's face was set with determination, as if he'd just taken on a mission far bigger than his rank. Maria, the caseworker, was on her phone, speaking rapidly in a mix of English and Spanish, her voice sharp with urgency. The crowd, veterans, locals, a few activists, lingered, unsure whether to disperse or stay. Ernie wanted to thank them, to say something profound, but words felt inadequate. He'd spent decades keeping his story small, tucked away like the dog tag in the box, and now it was spilling out, uncontainable. "Mr. Morales," a voice called, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the older veteran from earlier, the one with the Vietnam patch on his jacket. He approached slowly, leaning on a cane, his face weathered but kind. "Name's Tom Rivera. I was with the 1st Cavalry, 68 to 70. Heard you were 101 Airborne. That true?" Ernie nodded. "Yes, sir. 87 to 95. Rivera's eyes lit up with recognition. "Screaming Eagles. Tough outfit. You boys held the line at Kafchi. I read about it." He extended a hand and Ernie shook it, feeling the strength in the older man's grip despite his age. "You don't belong on no bus to Mexico, not after what you did." Ernie's throat tightened. He wasn't used to this, people knowing his past, let alone caring. "Just did my job," he mumbled, his default response when anyone brought up the war. Rivera chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "That's what we all say, son. Don't make it less true." He glanced at the crowd, then back at Ernie. "These folks showed up for you. That means something. Don't let it slip away." Before Ernie could respond, Maria approached, her phone still in hand. "Ernie, we've got a meeting with a lawyer tomorrow morning. Pro bono. The governor's office is under pressure now, thanks to this." She gestured at the crowd, the reporters. "But we need to move fast. The stay's only good for 30 days. 30 days, Ernie repeated, the words heavy. A month to prove he belonged in the country he'd served. It felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. Carter stepped forward. "I'm coming with you," he said. "To the meeting. My CO's already on board. He's reaching out to some contacts in D.C. We're not letting this go." Ernie looked at the young lieutenant, searching for the catch. "Why?" he asked again, the same question he'd posed in the holding room. "You don't know me." Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he seemed to wrestle with the answer. "My dad was a Marine," he said finally. "Vietnam, like Mr. Rivera. He came back broken, and the VA didn't do much for him. He used to say the only thing that kept him going was knowing his brothers in arms had his back. You're one of those brothers, sir. Doesn't matter if I know you. You're family." The word hit Ernie hard. Family. He hadn't had one in decades. His parents had died when he was young, and he'd lost touch with his cousins in Mexico. The Army had been his family once, but after his discharge, that bond had frayed, replaced by a solitary life of odd jobs and quiet evenings in a rented room. Now, here was this kid, barely older than the recruits Ernie had trained, calling him family. "Thank you," Ernie said, his voice steady but thick. He wanted to say more, but the immigration officer interrupted, approaching with a scowl. "All right, folks, show's over," the officer said, raising his voice. "Mr. Morales, you're released for now, but you need to report back here in 72 hours for a check-in. Don't leave the county." The crowd muttered, a few voices rising in protest, but Ernie raised a hand. "It's all right," he said. "I'll follow the rules." He always had, even when they broke him. Maria touched his arm. "I'll drive you home. You shouldn't be alone tonight." Home was a small studio apartment on the south side of Tucson, a place with peeling paint and a window that rattled in the wind. Ernie hadn't thought of it as home in years, just a place to sleep, but he nodded, grateful for Maria's offer. As they moved toward her car, the crowd parted, some people offering nods or quiet words of encouragement. A young woman with a Justice for Ernie sign stepped forward, holding out a small pin shaped like a purple heart. I made this, she said shyly, for you. Ernie took it, his fingers brushing the cheap metal. It wasn't official, but it felt heavier than the real one tucked away in a drawer at his apartment. Thank you, miss, he said, pinning it to his jacket. Carter walked with them to the car, promising to call in the morning. Rivera lingered nearby, watching with a proud, almost fatherly expression. As Ernie climbed into Maria's sedan, he glanced back at the courtyard, at the flag still waving under the floodlights. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like it was mocking him. The drive to his apartment was quiet, the city lights blurring past the window. Maria tried to make small talk, but Ernie's mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's events. The salute from Carter, the dog tag in the box, the crowd that had shown up for a man they didn't know. It felt like a dream, one he was afraid to wake from. When they reached his building, Maria parked and turned to him. Ernie, I need you to promise me something, she said. Don't give up. This fight's just starting, and we need you in it. He nodded, though he wasn't sure he had the strength for another battle. I'll try, he said, and that was the most honest answer he could give. Inside his apartment, the silence was deafening. The room was sparse. A twin bed, a folding chair, a small table with a radio that only picked up AM stations. On the wall, a single photograph. Ernie and his squad in Kuwait, their faces young and fearless. He set the wooden box on the table, opened it, and lifted out the dog tag. The metal was cool against his palm, its edges worn smooth by time. He slipped it over his head, the familiar weight settling against his chest, and for a moment he was 24 again, standing tall in the desert, ready to face anything. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it brought dreams of Kafji, the flash of tracer rounds, the taste of sand in his mouth, the weight of a wounded soldier slung across his shoulders. He woke before dawn, his heart racing, the dog tag still around his neck. The pin from the young woman glinted on his jacket, catching the light from a street lamp outside. The next morning, Maria picked him up for the lawyers' meeting. Carter was there, out of uniform but no less determined, carrying a folder of documents he'd pulled from military archives. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Delgado, laid out the plan. They'd file for a humanitarian parole, citing Ernie's military service and the hardship of deportation. The governor's office was interested thanks to the media coverage, but the clock was ticking. They needed more. Public support, letters from veterans, maybe a petition. Ernie listened, nodding when it spoke, but his mind kept drifting to the crowd from yesterday. They'd seen him, really seen him, in a way he hadn't been seen since his army days. It gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, they visited the VFW hall, where Rivera had first heard about Ernie's case. The place was a time capsule. Faded flags on the walls, photos of veterans from World War II to Afghanistan, the faint smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. Rivera was there, along with a dozen other veterans, some of whom remembered Ernie from years ago. They greeted him like a returning brother, clapping him on the back and sharing stories of their own battles with the VA or immigration. We're putting together a rally, Rivera said, spreading a flyer on the bar. This weekend at the courthouse. We're calling it Honor Our Heroes. You're the guest of honor, Ernie. Ernie shook his head, uncomfortable with the attention. I don't need a rally. Just want my papers. It's not just for you, Carter said, leaning in. It's for every veteran who's been screwed over like this. You're the spark, sir. Let us carry the flame. The words echoed in Ernie's mind over the next few days as the rally took shape. By Saturday, it had grown beyond the VFW hall. Local businesses donated food and water. A high school ROTC unit volunteered to present the colors. Reporters from national outlets were calling Maria, asking for interviews. And through it all, Ernie stayed quiet, helping set up chairs or fold flyers, his dog tag hidden under his shirt, his purple heart pin shining on his jacket. The rally drew hundreds. Veterans in old uniforms, families with signs, students from the university, even a few politicians trying to catch the wave. Rivera emceed, his voice cracking with emotion as he told Ernie's story. Carter spoke next, reading from Ernie's military record, his voice steady and proud. When it was time for Ernie to speak, he hesitated, his hands trembling as he stepped to the mic. I'm not much for words, he started, his voice soft but clear. I came to this country with nothing. The Army gave me a purpose, I served because I believed in America and what it stands for. I didn't ask for much, just a place to belong. His paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, finding Carter's nod, Maria's smile, Rivera's proud gaze. Yesterday, you gave me that. You reminded me I'm not alone, so thank you. The applause was overwhelming, but Ernie barely heard it. His felt unburdened, like he'd finally laid down a weight he'd carried for decades. As he stepped back, a young ROTC cadet approached, saluting him. Sir, the cadet said, we're dedicating our next drill to you. You're welcome to join us. Ernie returned the salute, his hand steady. I'd like that, he said. In the weeks that followed, the campaign grew. Letters poured into the governor's office, from veterans, from school children, from strangers, moved by Ernie's stories. Ms. Delgado filed the parole, and a congresswoman sponsored a private article for his citizenship. The media kept the pressure on, and the Immigration Service began reviewing similar cases nationwide. On the last day of his stay, Ernie stood in a courtroom again, this time in a suit Carter had helped him pick out. The judge, a former JAG officer, read the decision, humanitarian parole granted, with a recommendation for expedited citizenship. The room erupted, but Ernie stayed still, his hand resting on the dog tag under his shirt. Outside, the flag waited, and for the first time, Ernie felt like it was his. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, or a number on a deportation order. His was Ernesto Morales, a man with a story, a man who'd fought and won, not just for himself, but for every unseen veteran who'd served and been forgotten. As he walked with Carter and Rivera, Ernie noticed a new plaque on the courthouse wall, dedicated to veteran immigrants. It read, Honor our heroes never forgotten. His wasn't sure who'd paid for it, but it didn't matter. It was there, a small, permanent mark, like the pin on his jacket or the dog tag around his neck. This is the conclusion of Ernesto Morales' story, a reminder that compassion and respect can rewrite the ending. At Hoffman's Stories, we're committed to sharing tales of quiet heroism that inspire us to notice the unseen among us. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to discover more stories like Ernie's, and take a moment today to see the heroes in your own community. Their courage lives on through our acts of kindness. Edwin Clark, an 82-year-old man with a gray beard, stood at the entrance, clutching an old coffee mug engraved with the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis. His army jacket, with the faded name Clark on the chest, hung loosely on his thin shoulders and on his left arm, just above the wrist. A tattoo was visible, an anchor and globe, faded to a pale blue but still recognizable to those who knew. His eyes, deeply set and slightly moist from the cold air, scanned the crowd. Children darted between tables, veterans exchanged quiet nods, and organizers bustled, checking guest lists. Edwin wasn't in a hurry to enter. His cane tapped against the wooden floor as he finally stepped inside, feeling the chill of the morning air give way to the warmth of the crowded hall. He hadn't been here in years. The last time was sometime in the 90s, when his wife Mary held his hand and whispered that he should tell the school kids about his medals. But Mary had passed 5 years ago, and since then, Edwin had avoided such events. They didn't remind him of glory, but of loss. The jungles of Vietnam, the cries of his brothers in arms, the letters home he never sent. But this year, something had changed. The night before, while sorting through an old box in the basement, he found a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1971. The headline read, Local Hero Receives Silver Star for Bravery. Below it was his name, Edwin J. Clark, and a photograph of him, young with a crew cut, standing with a medal pinned to his chest, staring into the distance as if seeing a future he didn't understand. That clipping brought him here. Not for himself, but for those who didn't come back. And maybe for Mary, who always said his story was worth telling. Edwin moved slowly between the tables, feeling the wooden floor creak under his boots. The smell of coffee mingled with floor wax, and the hum of voices blended with the distant laughter of children chasing each other on the lawn outside. He paused at the first table, where artifacts from World War II were displayed. A dented helmet, a soldier's letter to his mother, a Purple Heart medal. Edwin nodded, as if greeting an old acquaintance, and moved on. His eyes searched for something specific, though he wasn't sure what. Maybe a memory. Maybe proof that his years in the jungle hadn't been in vain. Finally, he saw it. In the far corner of the hall, under a glass case, lay a silver star. Beside it was a bronze star and a few ribbons he recognized instantly. His heart pounded, just as it had the last time he saw those medals, in 1972, when he donated them to a museum in Cleveland, thinking it was for the best. But now they were here, in Collins, and on a small plaque beneath the glass, he read, Edwin J. Clark, U.S. Marine Corps, Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. The plaque was new, but the medals were his. He recognized the scratch on the back of the silver star, left when he'd tucked it into his pocket during a firefight in the jungle. Edwin reached out, unthinking. His fingers stopped an inch from the glass. He didn't want to take them, just to touch, to feel the weight of that day when he ran through gunfire to pull two wounded men, Gomez and Laney, to safety. The day his platoon called him a hero, but he felt only like a tired 22-year-old kid who wanted to go home. Hey, old man, don't touch the exhibits. A voice sharp as a snapping branch cut through from behind. Edwin flinched, his hand freezing in midair. He turned and saw a young officer in impeccably pressed trousers and a shirt bearing the National Guard emblem. The man, no older than 30, stood with his hands on his hips, his name tag reading, Lieutenant Justin Weirs. His eyes, cold and impatient, looked at Edwin as if he were just another visitor breaking the rules. I wasn't going to, Edwin began, his voice soft as a whisper of autumn leaves. Rules are rules, Weirs snapped, his tone sharp as a blade. These things aren't toys. They belong to history, not your hands. Step back, please. Edwin felt a hot wave rise to his cheeks. His fingers gripped the mug so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wanted to say these were his medals, his history, that he'd bled for them, lost friends, knights, peace. But the words stuck in his throat like dust from those jungles. He lowered his gaze and stepped back, feeling the glances of a few visitors, school kids, volunteers, slide over him and turn away. He was invisible again, an old man in an old jacket, with no right to touch history. Sorry, he mumbled, though Weirs had already turned away, answering a school kid's question about a rifle at the next table. Edwin shuffled to the window, his cane thumping dully against the floor. Outside, children chased each other on the lawn, their laughter filtering through the walls, reminding him of his daughter, Marilee, and how she used to run on that same lawn, laughing as Mary called her home. Mary, who said his story was worth telling. He stood, staring at the flag flapping in the wind, and remembered that day in 1969. The jungle was quiet, too quiet, so he could hear the sweat dripping from his brow onto the ground. His platoon was in ambush, waiting for the enemy. Beside him was Private Gomez, a 19-year-old kid from Texas who cracked jokes to hide his fear. When the firefight erupted, time slowed. Gomez fell first, clutching his leg, then Laney, whose scream cut through the air. Edwin didn't think. He lunged forward, ducking as bullets whistled overhead. He dragged Gomez to cover, then went back for Laney. Later, when his platoon called him a hero, he felt only like a tired kid who wanted to go home. The medals came later, the Silver Star for valor, the Bronze Star for service. He gave them to the museum because he didn't feel worthy of keeping them. But now they were here in Collins, and the plaque with his name stared at him like a challenge. He turned back to the table, unable to tear his eyes from the medals. His fingers reached for the glass again, but stopped. He didn't notice someone in uniform watching him from the other end of the hall. Those medals have a story, a voice said, deep and calm, with a note of respect. Edwin turned and saw an older man in an officer's uniform. His eyes, deep and familiar, had seen war. His name tag read, Colonel Jackson, retired. His posture was straight but not rigid, his gaze one that saw more than it seemed. You serve, the colonel asked, nodding at Edwin's tattoo. Yes, sir. Vietnam. Marines, 68 to 70, Edwin replied, his voice quiet but steady. The colonel smiled, his eyes glinting. I thought so. You've got the bearing. And the tattoo. He nodded at the medals. Those yours? Edwin hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about it. But something in the colonel's look, respect, understanding, made him nod. Yes, sir. Gave them to a museum long ago. Didn't think I'd see them again. The colonel frowned, his gaze sliding to Lieutenant Weirs, who was still talking to school kids, ignoring Edwin. Someone should have known that, he said quietly but firmly. Wait here. Edwin watched as the colonel strode toward Weirs. His heart pounded like it had that day in the jungle. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt this moment would change the meaning of this day. The flag outside flapped, its rope slapping the pole, and Edwin thought maybe Mary was right. Maybe his story was worth telling after all. Edwin Clark stood by the window of the community center in Collins, Ohio, clutching his old mug with Semper Fidelis etched on it. The cold glass reflected his face, wrinkles, gray beard, eyes that had seen too much. Outside, the flag flapped in the wind, its ropes striking the pole, reminding Edwin of distant war drums. Inside, the hall buzzed. Children laughed, volunteers chattered, and the medals under the glass case, his medals, watched him silently, like old friends he hadn't seen in half a century. Lieutenant Weirs, who had just sharply ordered him not to touch the exhibits, had turned away, busy with school kids crowding around the rifle table. Edwin felt invisible, as he had for much of his life after Vietnam, but someone saw. Colonel Jackson, retired, with gray at his temples and eyes that knew the weight of war, was walking toward Lieutenant Weirs with a bearing that made people around him quiet. Edwin couldn't hear their conversation, but saw Weirs frown, glance briefly his way, then nod as if receiving an order. The colonel returned to Edwin, his face calm but his eyes burning with resolve. Come with me, Marine, he said softly but firmly, placing a hand on Edwin's shoulder. Edwin nodded, unsure where this was leading, but feeling he couldn't refuse. His cane tapped the floor as they slowly walked to the center of the hall, where a small podium stood, surrounded by chairs for guests. The colonel gestured for Edwin to sit in the front row, but he shook his head. I'll stand, sir, he mumbled, gripping his mug tighter. The colonel nodded as if he understood, and stepped onto the podium. He tapped the microphone, and the hum in the hall began to fade. Children stopped chasing each other. Volunteers froze. Even Lieutenant Weirs, standing off to the side, turned to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, the colonel began, his voice deep as a church bell. We're gathered here to honor those who served. But sometimes we forget that heroes aren't just in history books or museum cases. Sometimes they stand among us, quietly carrying their stories. Edwin felt his heart race. He lowered his gaze, afraid everyone was looking at him. But the colonel continued. Today, I learned there's a man in this hall whose medals lie under glass. A man who, in 1969, in the jungles of Vietnam, risked his life to save two of his brothers. A man who received the Silver Star for bravery, but never asked for recognition. Edwin Clark, would you come forward? The hall fell silent. Edwin felt his legs turn to lead. He wanted to vanish, to hide behind his invisibility, but the colonel's gaze, respectful, almost paternal, urged him forward. His cane tapped the floor, each step echoing in his chest. He stopped by the podium, his eyes fixed on the wooden floor, avoiding the hundreds of gazes now turned toward him. The colonel motioned to Lieutenant Weirs, who approached hesitantly, holding the glass case with the medals. His face was pale. His eyes avoided Edwin's, but he obediently set the case on a table beside the podium. Lieutenant Weirs, the colonel said, his voice calm but with a hint of steel, you told this man he couldn't touch these medals, but I think we all agree. If anyone has the right to hold them, it's him. The hall erupted in applause. Edwin flinched, unaccustomed to such noise. His eyes misted as he looked up and saw people, old and young, veterans and school kids, standing, clapping. Lieutenant Weirs, his cheeks now burning, held out the Silver Star to him, cradling it in both hands, like a sacred offering. I'm sorry, sir, he mumbled, his voice trembling. I didn't know. Edwin looked at the medal, his fingers, old and wrinkled, shook as he took it. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe his hands had grown weaker. He ran a finger over the scratch on the back, and memories flooded in like a tide. That day, in 1969, was sweltering, the jungle air thick as syrup. Edwin lay on the ground, his rifle heavy with moisture, his heart pounding as they waited for the enemy. Private Gomez, a 19-year-old kid from Texas, whispered jokes to ease the silence. "Clark, if we get out of this, I'm buying you a beer," he said, grinning. Edwin just nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. When the firefight broke out, time stopped. Gomez fell first, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. Laney screamed as a bullet hit his shoulder. Edwin didn't think. He lunged forward, ducking as bullets whistled overhead. He dragged Gomez to cover, his blood leaving a trail in the dirt. Then he went back for Laney, ignoring the sergeant's shouts to fall back. When it was over, Gomez lived. Laney didn't. Edwin sat in the mud, his hands shaking as Gomez whispered, "You're a hero, Clark." But Edwin didn't feel like a hero. He felt empty. Edwin stood on the podium, holding the medal, as the colonel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tell us, Edwin," he said softly. "Tell us what happened that day." Edwin shook his head, his throat tight. He'd never told this story to anyone, not even Mary, who knew only fragments. But the people's gazes, not curious, but respectful, urged him to speak. "It was a long time ago," he began, his voice trembling like leaves in the wind. "We were in an ambush. My guys, Gomez and Laney, they got hit. I just did what I had to. Pulled them out. But Laney? He didn't make it." The hall was silent, only the flag outside flapping, its rope striking the pole. Edwin felt a tear roll down his cheek, but didn't wipe it away. He looked at the medal, then at the people. "I'm no hero," he said quietly. "The heroes are the ones who didn't come back." The applause started slowly, but grew like a wave. Edwin lowered his gaze, his heart aching with pain and nostalgia. He thought of Mary, who always urged him to tell this story. Of Marilee, who was proud of him, though he never understood why. And of Gomez, who survived but died in a car crash in the 80s, never buying him that beer. The colonel raised a hand, calling for silence. "Edwin," he said, "you remind us why we're here. Not for the medals, but for those who stood beside us." He turned to Lieutenant Weirs. "Lieutenant, do you have anything to say?" Weirs stepped forward, his face pale, but his eyes sincere. "Sir," he said, looking at Edwin, "I made a mistake. I didn't know who you were, but now I do, and I extended his hand. I'm proud to stand before you." Edwin looked at the lieutenant's hand. For a moment he hesitated, then shook it. The grip was firm, and in Weir's eyes, he saw something new. Respect. The hall erupted in applause again. Children clapped, not fully understanding, but feeling the moment's weight. Veterans in the back stood, some brushing away tears. Edwin felt his shoulders straighten, for the first time in years. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Edwin sat by the window holding the silver star in his hands. Colonel Jackson approached, holding an old photograph he'd found among the exhibits. Edwin in 1971, young, with the medal on his chest. "This is yours," he said, handing over the photo. "And I spoke with the organizers. They want you to speak next year. Tell your story again." Edwin took the photo, his fingers trembling. He looked at the young version of himself, the one who didn't yet know how war would cast shadows over his life. He thought of Mary, who would have smiled at this day, of Marilee, now living in California, who might have come if she'd known. "I'll think about it, sir," he said quietly. The colonel nodded and left, leaving Edwin with his thoughts. Outside, the flag kept flapping, and Edwin felt something shift inside him. Not loud pride, but quiet dignity. He was no longer invisible. The next week, a plaque appeared by the community center in Collins in honor of Edwin J. Clark, Vietnam hero. Local veterans began meeting monthly, sharing their stories. And Edwin, though he didn't like the attention, sometimes came, holding his Semper Fidelis mug, listening as younger veterans called him Sir. This story is a reminder for us all. Heroes live among us, often unnoticed, carrying their stories quietly, like a flag in the wind. Pause. listen. Reach out. A small act of respect can restore dignity and remind us who we are. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories to hear more tales of quiet heroism in our communities. Eddie Crow, well into his 70s, was short but sturdy, with a posture that hinted at the discipline of long-gone years. His hands, etched with a web of wrinkles, rested on the table, cradling a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. On his left temple, just above his eye, was a tattoo, a crudely inked eagle with outstretched wings, faded to a bluish-gray hue. It looked out of place on his weathered face, like a scar telling a story no one bothered to ask about. Eddie rarely spoke of himself, and when he did, it was brief, with a quiet smile that seemed to say, "It doesn't matter." But in his eyes, deep and dark as an autumn sky, lay the weight of decades. That morning, Eddie had walked into the diner, as he always did, at 7 sharp. He ordered his usual, scrambled eggs with 2 slices of toast and black coffee. The waitress, a young woman named Clara, gave him a warm smile but quickly turned her attention to other tables. Eddie didn't mind. He was used to being invisible, a shadow slipping through the hum of a world that had long stopped noticing men like him. But this morning was different. At a nearby table sat a group of 4 men, all around 40, dressed in work jackets and ball caps. They were talking loudly, laughing over some story about fishing, when one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a beard, suddenly fell silent and nodded toward Eddie. "Look at that old guy," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "What's with that tattoo? Looks like he lost a bet in some dive bar back in the 70s. The others laughed, their voices cutting through the air like a dull knife. Eddie didn't look up from his cup, but his fingers tightened ever so slightly on the ceramic handle. He heard it all, the laughter, the jab, the faint edge of contempt they didn't even try to hide. The tattoo above his eye wasn't a choice. It was a brand, carved into his skin during captivity, in jungles where the smell of gunpowder and fear was thicker than the air. Back in 1971, he'd pulled 24 brothers in arms out from under fire, but he himself was captured. The tattoo was their souvenir, a mockery of his courage. To Eddie, though, it was a mark of survival, a sign he'd endured more than those men could ever imagine. He took a sip of cold coffee, trying to block out their laughter, but the sound burrowed into him, like fine rain, soaking through clothes to the bone. Eddie wasn't one to respond to slights. He simply sat, his shoulders slumping just a fraction, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window, where the flag swayed in the breeze. Then, the diner's door swung open and a man entered, one Willow Springs rarely saw. General James T. Wilson, retired, stood tall and lean despite his 65 years, carrying an aura that made people around him instinctively straighten their posture. His silver hair was neatly combed and his civilian clothes fit, as if he'd just stepped out of a command post. Wilson came to town once a year to visit his brother's grave at the local cemetery, always stopping at Marge's for coffee. But this time, his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, landed on Eddie. He noticed the laughter. He saw the 4 men exchanging mocking glances, nodding toward the old veteran. And he noticed the tattoo. To Wilson, who'd seen war closer than most would ever want, it wasn't just a tattoo. It was a story. He approached Eddie's table slowly, holding his coffee, and stopped across from him. "Mind if I sit, Sergeant?" His voice was low but clear, laced with a respect that made Eddie look up. Eddie blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't been called sergeant in decades. But something in Wilson's gaze, in his calm certainty, made Eddie nod. The general sat, setting his cup on the table, and leaned in slightly. "I've seen a tattoo like that before," Wilson said quietly. "Vietnam, right? Captivity?" Eddie froze. His fingers tightened around his mug, but he didn't look away. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Saigon, 1971, 24 men. I got them out. But me, they held on to me." Wilson nodded, his eyes never leaving Eddie's face. 24. That's not just a number, Sergeant. That's a feat." Eddie shrugged, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Just did what I had to do." But Wilson wasn't letting it go. He leaned back, his gaze hardening. "You know they're laughing over there?" He nodded toward the men, who had quieted, sensing the tension at the nearby table. They don't know what it means, but I do. And I'm not going to let them disrespect you. Eddie shook his head. It's not worth it, sir. They just don't know. That's exactly why I'm here, Wilson said sharply. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. Then, in full view of the diner, he turned to Eddie and gave him a crisp, respectful salute. For your service, Sergeant Crow, and for your sacrifice. The diner fell silent. Spoons stopped clinking. Clara froze with a coffee pot in hand. The four men at the nearby table exchanged uneasy glances, their smirks gone. Eddie, his eyes glistening, stood slowly and returned the salute. His hand trembled, but his posture was as straight as the young Marine he'd once been. Wilson wasn't done. He turned to the table of men, his voice cold and sharp as a bayonet. You four, he began, his words slicing through the silence. You think that man's tattoo is a joke? You know what he's been through? 24 brothers are alive because of him. And you dare to laugh because you can't imagine what real courage looks like. The men froze. The bearded one, who'd started the jeering, looked down, his face reddening. We didn't know, sir, he muttered. We were just... You didn't know because you didn't ask, Wilson cut him off. Next time you want to laugh, think about who you're hurting. That man is a hero, and you're just sitting here, laughing. He turned back to Eddie, his expression softening. Sergeant, let me buy you breakfast, and, if you'll allow me, I'd like to hear your story. Eddie blinked, his throat tight. No story, sir. Just did my job. Then let me tell it, Wilson said. That day, something shifted in Marge's diner. Clara, who'd overheard the exchange, set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Eddie without a word, but her eyes shone with respect. The four men quietly gathered their things and left, their breakfasts unfinished. And Eddie, who'd been just Mr. Eddie for years, felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't known since he came home, in 1973. Wilson sat across from him and began to ask, not prying, but with a quiet respect that made Eddie remember. He spoke of the jungles, of the night he dragged wounded brothers through the mud, of bullets whistling overhead while he prayed for enough strength. He told of captivity, of the tattoo his captors etched as a taunt, but which he wore as a mark of victory over death. And he spoke of the letter, yellowed, folded in his jacket pocket, written by a captain whose life he'd bought with his own freedom. Wilson listened without interrupting. When Eddie pulled out the letter and placed it on the table, the general unfolded it carefully. There, in faded ink, it read, To Sergeant Edward Crow, for exceptional bravery and sacrifice. You are an honor to the Marine Corps. The signature belonged to a captain who died a year after writing it. This isn't just a letter, Wilson said. This is a legacy. Eddie shrugged, but his eyes shone. Just did what I had to do. That day, Eddie's story began to spread through Willow Springs. Clara told her friends. Marge, the diner's owner, hung a copy of the letter in a frame above the register, next to the flag she raised every day. And General Wilson, when he returned to town the following year, brought with him an idea, a memorial plaque for Eddie and the other veterans whose stories had gone unnoticed. But for Eddie, the moment that mattered most was when he stood from his seat, feeling the eyes of the diner on him. He didn't want fame. He didn't want apologies. But when Clara held the door for him and the old flag fluttered in the breeze, he felt something he hadn't in years, dignity. This story is just the beginning. In every town, there's an Eddie, a quiet hero whose story waits to be noticed. So next time you see someone who seems invisible, pause, ask, listen. Because small acts of respect can change everything. Discover more inspiring stories at Hoffman's Stories. Subscribe to Uncover the Heroes Among Us. The autumn sun hung low over Willow Springs, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement outside Marge's diner. The air carried the crisp bite of October, laced with the faint sweetness of fallen leaves and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Inside the diner, the rhythm of life continued. Plates clinked, coffee brewed, and the jukebox in the corner played a soft rendition of Sweet Caroline that felt like a warm blanket over the room. The flag outside still fluttered, its frayed edges catching the breeze, a quiet reminder of stories untold. At his usual corner booth, Eddie Crow sat, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, the faint outline of his eagle tattoo barely visible in the dim light. It had been a week since General Wilson's visit, since the moment that had shifted something in the air of Willow Springs. The diner felt different now, not louder or busier, but heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed Eddie's story and refused to let it go. The framed letter above the cash register, its faded ink glowing under the fluorescent lights, had become a silent sentinel, drawing curious glances from regulars and strangers alike. Marge, with her graying bun and sharp eyes, had taken to polishing the frame daily, as if it were a sacred relic. Eddie, though, remained the same, quiet, unassuming, his worn jacket draped over the booth, his eyes fixed on the world outside. But the town was changing. Word of Eddie's past had spread like ripples on a pond, carried by Clara's whispers to her friends, by Marge's proud retellings, by the hushed conversations of those who'd been in the diner that day. The four men who had laughed at Eddie hadn't returned, but their absence wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way people looked at him now, not with pity, but with something closer to reverence. Strangers nodded to him on the street. Kids who once ignored the old man shuffling past now waved. And Clara, barely 20, had started slipping extra slices of pie onto his plate, her shy smile saying more than words ever could. Eddie felt the shift, though he'd never admit it. He wasn't one for attention. He'd spent decades burying his past, letting it sink into the silence of his days. But now, that silence was breaking, and it wasn't just the diner. The town council, spurred by General Wilson's parting words, had begun discussing a memorial, not just for Eddie, but for all the veterans whose stories had faded into the background of Willow Springs. It was a small idea still in its infancy, but it carried weight. Eddie didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted to disappear, to slip back into the shadows where he'd been comfortable for so long. But another part, the part that still stood tall when he saluted the flag each morning, felt something stirring, a quiet pride he hadn't allowed himself in years. That morning, as Eddie sipped his coffee, the diner's door swung open with a jingle. A woman entered, her presence commanding despite her simple attire, a navy blazer, gray slacks, and a scarf tied loosely around her neck. She was in her 50s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, a journalist from a regional paper who'd caught wind of Eddie's story through a friend of Clara's. She carried a notebook, its edges worn from years of use, and a camera slung over her shoulder. She scanned the diner, her gaze landing on Eddie almost immediately. "Mr. Crow?" she asked, approaching his booth with a smile that was both warm and professional. "I'm Eleanor Hayes, with the County Herald. May I join you?" Eddie's shoulders tensed, his fingers tightening around his mug. He wasn't used to strangers knowing his name, let alone seeking him out. But her tone was gentle, not pushy, and something in her eyes reminded him of the nurses who'd cared for him after his release from captivity. He nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. Eleanor slid into the booth, setting her notebook on the table. "I heard about what happened here last week," she said, her voice low enough to keep their conversation private. "About you and General Wilson and everything. I'd like to write about it if you're willing. Not just for the paper, but for you. For what you did." Eddie's jaw tightened. He looked down at his coffee, the steam curling upward like ghosts of old memories. "Ain't much to tell," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I did my job, that's all." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes softening. "Mr. Crow, I've been writing about veterans for 20 years. I've heard that line before. But what you did, saving 24 men, surviving what you survived, that's not just a job. It's a legacy. And I think people need to hear it." Eddie shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. He wasn't a hero, not in his own mind. Heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones whose names were etched on stones in cemeteries. He was just a man who'd kept going, one foot in front of the other, through jungles and nightmares and decades of silence. But Eleanor's gaze held no judgment, only patience. And that made him pause. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter now?" "Because," Eleanor said, "there are people in this town, in this country, who've forgotten what sacrifice looks like. They see an old man with a tattoo and laugh because they don't know. But if they hear your story, they might start to understand, and you deserve that. Eddie didn't respond right away. He looked out the window where the flag swayed gently, its stars catching the morning light. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he'd carried for 50 years. He thought of the men he'd saved, their faces blurred by time but never forgotten. And he thought of the laughter from last week, the sting of it still lingering like a bruise. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady, "but I ain't doing it for me. Do it for them, the ones who didn't make it back." Eleanor smiled, a quiet triumph in her eyes. "Deal." Over the next hour, Eddie told her his story, piece by piece, like unearthing relics from a buried life. He spoke of the jungles of Vietnam, the heat so thick it felt like breathing mud. He described the night of the ambush, the chaos of gunfire and screams, the way he dragged his wounded brothers through the muck one by one, until his hands bled and his lungs burned. He told her about the months in captivity, the hunger, the darkness, and the eagle tattoo they'd forced on him as a mark of shame. But he also told her how he'd turned it into something else, a badge of survival, a reminder that he'd walked out of that hell and carried on. Eleanor listened, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook, but her eyes never left Eddie's face. She asked questions gently, probing without pushing, and when he faltered, she waited. By the time he finished, the diner had filled with the lunch crowd, but their corner felt like a world apart. Clara brought them fresh coffee, her movements quiet as if she sensed the weight of the moment. When Eddie reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter, Eleanor's breath caught. She took it carefully, as if it were made of glass, and read the words aloud, her voice soft but clear. "To Sergeant Edward Crow, for exceptional bravery and sacrifice. You are an honor to the Marine Corps." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "This is incredible, Mr. Crow. May I include it in the story?" Eddie nodded, his throat tight. "Do what you need to do." The article appeared in the County Herald 3 days later, front page, with a black and white photo of Eddie sitting in his booth. The letter spread out before him. The headline read, "The Quiet Hero of Willow Springs." It told his story, not just the heroics, but the aftermath, the years of silence, the way he'd carried his pain without complaint. It spoke of General Wilson's salute, of the laughter that had sparked a reckoning, of a town waking up to the man in their midst. Eleanor had woven it all together with a warmth that avoided sentimentality, letting Eddie's actions speak for themselves. The impact was immediate. By noon, Marge's diner was packed, not just with regulars, but with people from neighboring towns who'd read the article and come to pay their respects. They didn't crowd Eddie, didn't overwhelm him with questions. Instead, they left small tokens, a handshake, a nod, a murmured, "Thank you for your service." One man, a veteran himself, left a Marine Corps pin on Eddie's table, saying nothing before walking away. Clara started a jar for donations, labeled simply, "For the Memorial," and by the end of the day, it was overflowing with bills and coins. Eddie, true to form, tried to deflect the attention. He thanked people quietly, his voice gruff, and kept his eyes on his coffee. But there was a change in him, a subtle straightening of his shoulders, a lightness in his step as he left the diner each evening. He didn't talk about it, but Clara noticed the way he lingered a little longer, the way his fingers traced the edge of the letter before slipping it back into his pocket. A month later, the town council voted unanimously to dedicate a memorial plaque in the town square, not just to Eddie, but to all veterans of Willow Springs. General Wilson returned for the ceremony, standing beside Eddie as the mayor unveiled the bronze plaque, engraved with names and dates that spanned decades. The crowd was small but reverent, their breath visible in the chilly November air. The flag above them snapped in the wind, and for a moment, Eddie felt the weight of every name on that plaque, every story he'd carried with him. Wilson leaned close, his voice low. "This is because of you, Sergeant. You reminded them what honor looks like." Eddie shook his head, his eyes fixed on the plaque. "It ain't about me, sir. It's about them." But as the crowd applauded, as Clara wiped tears from her cheeks, as Marge hung a second copy of the letter in the diner, Eddie felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was the sense that he'd finally come home, not to Willow Springs, but to himself. The memorial became a touchstone for the town. People left flowers at its base, veterans gathered there to share stories, and kids learned the names of those who'd served. Eddie still came to Marge's every morning, still ordered his eggs and coffee, still sat in his corner booth. But he wasn't invisible anymore. And in the quiet moments, when the diner was empty and the flag outside caught the light, he'd touch the letter in his pocket and smile. This is the power of noticing the unnoticed, of honoring the silent. In every town, there's an Eddie Crow, a hero whose story waits to be heard. So pause, look, listen. A small act of kindness, a nod, a door held open, a simple thank you can change everything. Discover more stories of quiet heroism at Grateful Stories. Subscribe to celebrate the unsung heroes among us.